So the conference is being recorded, and what I also wanted to make sure everybody is aware of is you need to be on the web for the visual, and you need to call in for the audio part. So if you're, we'll send the call out, the call number out in the chat message box, so you should be able to see that there. There it is now, so just make sure you can sign in and use the access code indicated there. The other thing to keep in mind is if you have questions, we're going to handle all of the questions at the end of the webinar, so there's time for that. So just submit your questions using the Q&A chat box, and we have somebody who's monitoring that, and then we'll go through and make sure we get them all addressed at the end of the webinar. If we don't get through all of them, then I'll make sure to be able to send out a response to them. Because you're registered for the webinar, you will get an automatic email when the recording of the webinar is available, so that'll come right back out to you directly. Okay, so with all that being said, I think that's probably good. You might see a couple more sort of housekeeping text come through in the chat box from the chairperson who's kind of monitoring things in the background. But otherwise, I think given the time, I'm going to get rolling into this webinar. So my name's Elaine Vanier, and I'm the technical manager for the animal wellness programs at NSF International. And I have a degree in veterinary medicine as well as a Bachelor of Science in Agriculture with an animal science major. Before joining NSF, I had a 26-plus year career with the Government of Canada. And my areas of responsibility were humane handling and transport in the slaughter area, on-farm animal biosecurity, animal health emergency management, animal identification and traceability, as well as animal health risk assessment. I'm also certified PACO for meat, plant, and poultry. So right now I'm currently located in Virginia, so that's why we're doing this call out of the Eastern time zone. And my role right now at NSF is the responsibility is for, leading standards and audit criteria development. I'm the technical advisor and subject matter expert for animal wellness audit and certification programs, and those are going to encompass welfare, feed, pet food, and animal production. So going on, what we're going to do here is just a little bit briefly about NSF, and then really this is just focusing on, and I'm hoping a lot of the participants had an opportunity to see the webinar we presented in March on the standards themselves, the NSF Global Animal Wellness Standards, which is really integral to why we're doing this webinar on the hazard analysis. If you haven't had an opportunity to see that webinar, just send us an email because we can give you the recording of that webinar for information's sake. But one of the big key things about the value that our company can bring to companies and clients that we have is we have a really strong global presence around the world, several offices that we're operating out of and servicing over 175 countries. That means what we can do is we can work with global clients, but we also understand and be able to develop whatever the needs are and meet the needs that are locally available at the point of the service delivery. So it's one of those strengths that we have with NSF, that local understanding but global reach. If you have had a chance, an opportunity to look at the Global Animal Wellness Standards that we launched in February of this year, this is really just an indication of the components of that standard, of those standards, and all of them are the same. The standards are available on the NSF International website, so if you have any trouble finding those, just, again, let us know. We can get those out to you. Okay, I'm just seeing that there's a couple of people that are not hearing the audio, so again, it's hard to say, but just the chat messages are coming out from the chairperson to make sure you sign into the call. That really is irrelevant because if you can't hear, you just couldn't hear that. Anyhow. So what I wanted to do on this one is just indicate that from the perspective of the standards, in the system components, those 5 segments on the left-hand side, that's the Animal Welfare Management System, and that's aligned with the ISO Technical Specification 34700 that was released in December of 2016. And the reason I'm highlighting that is because what we have done with this standard is come from a very observational, field observation related and prescriptive approach to animal welfare auditing to a management system audit approach. And that gives us a lot of strength in terms of being able to ensure that, year-round these facilities that we're auditing are actually able to demonstrate how they're able to meet their animal welfare objectives across the board. So the reason I highlight that too is because within the management commitment, policy, procedures, and planning requirements, we are requiring that facilities that are being audited to this standard are able to demonstrate that they have an effective animal welfare management system in place. And that system has to cover all of the relevant animal species and life stages of animals that are under the responsibility of the organization. In that segment of the standard, we're also requiring facilities identify what their animal welfare objectives are. And that's really critical because that's how you understand, when you're looking at it from an audit perspective, how well they're meeting their objectives and how the system is effectively doing that for them. So in that same segment, we are asking that facilities are preparing and have documented procedures and operating protocols and an overall animal welfare plan. And within that is where we require that a hazard analysis has been conducted. This is to identify and determine any of the hazards that are relevant to that operation and need to be controlled. Within that hazard analysis is a requirement to define the control measures that are applied, and this can include prerequisite programs or control points. We also talk about having the requirement for, if it's necessary, critical control points and the associated critical thresholds that would apply. And a new concept, and I'll describe this a little bit more in detail as we get further in the presentation, points of particular attention and the associated tolerance limits associated with them. We're also looking for facilities and operations to identify the indicators. These can be either animal or resource-based, and these are what are used to assess the control measures have actually appropriately addressed the hazard. So getting now into the heart of this webinar, which is conducting a hazard analysis, the real key part about this is that when you're looking at animal management practices and processes, these are always interconnected within very complex interrelationships, and there are often really strong impacts in one area from changes or activities in another area. And so what we're trying to do is provide facilities and operations a tool or a technique that would help get this really clear as much as possible. And by using a HACCP-based approach, when you're looking at animal welfare, this can help with giving facilities and operations a way to systematically identify and control the key hazards to animal welfare and wellness throughout their system. So when taking a look at the different points in the supply chain, primary producers, if they are implementing a HACCP-based approach, it's viewed as a mechanism to really structure and formalize what a really good producer or operator is probably already doing. And then from a transporter's perspective, utilizing this same kind of system can help provide measurements and be able to monitor the efficiency and performance of livestock handling and transport operations. Also, at the slaughter operations, often the use of critical control points in a process would be monitored and it's a way to ensure that they're performing the activities correctly and consistently. And this leads to steady improvements in welfare and operational quality. And when I get into a little bit further into the webinar, you'll actually see a lot of these things are already recognized within industry standards or other certification standards. So it's really not a new concept. It's really just taking a very structured approach to representing the concepts. So this is where your knowledge of HACCP is going to come in really, really useful. And none of this is any different than what you would expect if you were looking at HACCP for food safety. The first 5 steps of a HACCP, preparing a HACCP plan, are the 5 prerequisites. The first is to identify an animal welfare team. The second and third are identify the scope of animal production and the product information, and identify the use and consumers. Fourth is create a flow diagram, and fifth is verify that flow diagram. And I'll go into a little bit more detail into each of these in the next few slides. So number 1, identify the animal welfare lead and team. Ideally, what you want to do is assemble a multidisciplinary and facility-based HACCP team. This can be complicated depending on the size of the facility or the operation. It may only be one person, or it may be a combination of internal working for the facility and external, maybe a consultant. So it really depends on the facility, but there really does need to be a designated animal welfare lead who is part of that operation. It should ideally include relevant personnel. So looking at the requirements of the standards, having somebody who understands animal wellness and welfare, ideally. Maintenance is a good contributor to this, as well as sanitation. And there could be others. If you've got your veterinarian involved in your team, even better. So the second step, identify the scope of production and product information. This is where you want to have a really good, clear facility description. What type of operation are we talking about here? What point in the supply chain? Looking at the different production systems, define the stages, the life stages of animals that are under the responsibility of the organization in all of the units that are handling animals. And this would definitely apply to if you've included a certain life stage or production a production stage of animal in your scope for the certification to these standards. Those are the ones you want to make sure you've got covered. Looking at the production types. This is also an area where we look for, are there any specific management claims, for example, grass-fed animals or cage-free layers, etc. And this is also a good place to reflect if there's any legislation, certification, or even customer requirements that are really defining how you manage your operation. This can be anywhere from breed type, as defined by certification, or square footage requirements, outdoor access, etc. You also want to identify the final products of the system. Is it a live animal, or is there product collection, and so forth? This could include meat as well. And finally, identifying, are there any exclusions? And this is interesting because you may want to exclude some aspects of your production, animal production, but keep in mind that if there are operations that are impacting excluded and non-excluded, or animals that are covered under the certification, any area where they both share would be part of and covered in your HACCP plan. Identify the use and the consumers. Who's the target market, including specific customers. And this, again, ties back to identifying the use or identifying the parameters around it. If you've got customers that are requiring certain things, you're going to want to identify and make sure that that's in your HACCP plan. Number 4 is creating a flow diagram. And this is useful because it can help you to identify points in the process where those hazards can be introduced or likely to occur. And it also helps identify whether or not this could be a point where you need a preventive control measure. The flow diagrams need to provide a good sequence and interaction of the steps in the operation. Focus on where inputs are entering the flow. This can be, these are just a couple of examples. Water, air, ventilation, feed, bedding is another one. Where any outsourced processes or subcontracted work enter the flow. For example, pest control, veterinary services, catching and transport. And another aspect to pay attention to is where outputs leave the process. So that's the product, the live animals themselves, waste products, or dead stock. What you want to take into account are some of the inputs. And material inputs include but are not limited to. And there's a list here. Feed and supplements, roughage, colostrum. These may be something that you're purchasing. Bedding that's brought into the operation, medication, insecticides or pesticides, water, air, and any purchased animals or genetic material. Service inputs include, but are not limited to, feed delivery or harvesting services. That's if you're growing crops on your property that are going to be used to feed your animals, but you're not necessarily doing the actual harvesting. Pest control services, catching, loading, or transport services, or veterinary services. This is just a very simple example of a flow chart. And it's of a goat operation. It's a milk and goat, dairy goat operation. And they start from receiving purchased animals. They move through a quarantine step. And they've also identified in this flow chart where the CCPs and the points of particular attention are. And I'll get into a little bit more about what those ones are. And it's really just following the pathway through where the animals are going, how they're going to be managed. And this is showing that the males are sold off. There's inputs in these bubbles here, inputs of either materials or services. The next big key step is to verify that flow diagram. This is where the utilization of operation maps and I like aerial photographs of properties because it really does help to identify, have you got the right information included in your flow diagram. It also helps you to identify those boundaries, the facilities and the buildings that you've got in your operations. When you have, for example, if you've got pasture provision to your animals, and utilizing a map to verify your flow diagram can help when you are moving animals from one pasture to the other. It also helps to identify where animals are moved to and within your property, or also off the property. And sometimes you have animals moving off property and then coming back to property. So these are important things to be able to verify in your flow diagram. Also important to indicate movement of personnel, vehicles, and other equipment into, off the property and within the property. You want to also make sure you're including all sites where animals are held and within the scope. And that means for production operations, there may be, for example, some pasture or community pasture you might be moving your animals to during some part of the season that's not connected to your main farm property. Those would be some areas you would also want to take into account in your flow diagrams and verification. Some other examples, slaughter operations. I've been to operations where the actual lairage is off-site from where the slaughter facility is. And so there may be opportunities that you need to take a little bit of a different look at that flow diagram and then verification of it. So the verification process for verifying that flow diagram and the map on site is usually something you want to have the animal welfare team do. And doing it on site, do walking through or drive through of the operations themselves and make sure that this is correct. The other really key things to think about is have the flow diagrams and the verification of the flow diagrams taken into account all stages of production, all ages of the animals that are being held there, and all times of year, because that's going to have a distinct impact in some areas of the world in terms of operation and impact. Okay, so once you've got those prerequisites of your HACCP plan done, now we roll into the 7 principles of the HACCP, conducting a HACCP analysis. And this is not anything new or different than if you've ever done a HACCP analysis or a HACCP plan and hazard analysis for food safety. They're all the same HACCP principles. And what I'm going to do is really focus on where are those key differences. So step 1 is conduct the hazard analysis. Step 2, identify your critical control points, and a new bit of terminology there, identify your points of particular attention. Step 3, establish the critical limits for your CCPs and the tolerances for the points of particular attention. And step 4, establish monitoring requirements for those CCPs and points of particular attention. Step 5 is when your critical limits or tolerances are exceeded, what are the corrective measures that need to be taken? Step 6 is verification procedures. And I'm going to talk just a little bit too about validation procedures as well at that point. And then step 7, you're establishing your record-keeping procedures, what records need to be kept, and so forth. So step 1, this is where I'm going to focus the most attention, because this is the part of the process that is going to feel a lot different than what you're used to if you've done a HACCP plan for food safety. In the hazard identification or the hazard analysis, what you want to do is cover the hazard identification, do a hazard assessment, and then identify those preventive and control measures. Okay, 1 second. I'll be right there. Okay. So when you're doing a hazard identification, the mechanism and terminology used will be very different. And the way to categorize hazards may be very different than what you're used to. And I go into some of those different ways of categorizing hazards, because some operations will feel a little bit more comfortable using one mechanism and set of terminology than another. So we're all used to and very comfortable with the concepts of biological, chemical, radiological, and physical. And you can utilize that same approach to identify the hazards from a perspective of animal welfare using the BCP approach. So under the biological, obviously, disease pathogens, soil contaminants such as anthrax could be another one, internal or external parasites. These are examples of hazards. Chemical radiological, you could have feed-related contaminants or agricultural pesticides or herbicides there. And under physical, for example, metal fragments or injuries from broken fence. This is another way of representing the hazards by utilizing it under the category of a poor outcome. So what it is it's not referenced as a biological, chemical, radiological, or physical. It's more represented on something that is either animal-based or design-based or management-based. So animal-based is generally a hazard that are physiological and naturally occurring during the life cycle of an animal. For example, as you can see there, weight loss or low body condition, lameness, or even aggressive behavior. These are aspects of the animal, and they could be described as a poor outcome or an undesired outcome. Design-based are typically hazards associated with building equipment or even plan design. And for example, grazing plan design, it could be something that's not desirable about that. So some of the examples of design-based poor outcomes or not desired outcomes: inadequate ventilation or insufficient space allowance or insufficient headroom in transport vehicle. Getting back to, for example, a grazing plan design, a grazing plan that does not take into account seasonal aspects. So that could be something that's included. Management-based or managerial-based hazards are something that can be directly tied to poor management. So examples there are pain that happens during or is inflicted during husbandry practices, incorrect handling during loading or handling, or poor pasture quality. And there's also another category that's called environmental-based. They're generally a little more difficult to reflect in here, but they can be as well another poor outcome. For example, that could be the poor pasture quality could also qualify as an environmental-based. Another way to express the hazards could be in terms of the impact. And so this is just three ways of reflecting that impact. So factors that are attributable to the animal itself, very similar in some ways to an animal-based hazard or poor outcome, but they are often reflected in the positive sense. So looking for a hazard that they have an ability to tolerate heat, that there's good mothering ability, or suitable to the local climate or a grazing environment. If you flipped it over and said the inability to tolerate heat, you could then say it's very similar to a poor outcome that's animal-based. There's a lot of similarity in this one, but sometimes there's just some slight differences. The other way to look at it are factors that are directly impacting the animals, such as feed or bedding, handling itself, use of restrainers and squeezes, or pen space and stocking density. And then also looking at factors that could indirectly impact animals, for example, fire or drought, local soil conditions, topography, climate, and rainfall. So by looking at it from these different lenses, you're going to be able to identify a lot more of the hazards, and the hazard identification does need to be comprehensive. It doesn't mean that every one of them is going to require a control program, but even at least consideration of it is going to be useful. So the next step, once you've got all your hazards identified, is do that hazard assessment. And that hazard assessment is really intended to determine whether or not there is a need to eliminate or reduce that hazard to an acceptable level in order to be able to achieve the stated animal welfare objectives of the facility. It also would determine whether or not there's a control that's needed and ensuring that the defined acceptable levels are met. So each hazard has to be identified according to and using the severity of the adverse effects in alignment with what's the likelihood of their occurrence. When you utilize that approach, again, you're able to create these grids and a risk map. And now your approach to managing the hazards becomes a risk-based approach. And this is really the goal of conducting this hazard assessment of your identified hazards. The other advantage of this is when you can put your hazards on this risk map, you have and I like this one because it kind of gives you that sort of heat map approach to it. You can identify those areas where you will really need to make sure the focus for control has to be. It will also give you a clue as to whether or not there's a likelihood for putting in place a CCP, or if you can just look at it in terms of a point of particular attention. So once you've got those identified hazards and you've got the risk rating of those hazards, now is the point where you've got to look at how are you going to manage the hazard. And this requires also an idea of where to focus the energy first. I like this slide. It's something that I got after having a great conversation with Temple Grand, and really is providing a good way to focus. How do you determine a priority when you've got this list of hazards and the risk of those hazards being a factor in your operation? Where do you focus your attention? And this is where she's indicated at step 1, you want to make sure you're eliminating abuse, neglect, and cruelty. And then at step 2, implementing measures and systems and assessment tools. This is the first key part, which is the prevention of cruelty. The step 3 and step 4 is where you're starting to look at improvements in quality of life. And this may be ways that are satisfying an animal's basic needs, behavioral needs. These can be things like adding enrichments, or even step 4, providing environments that enable an animal to have truly positive emotions. So really you're looking at going beyond just the basics of prevention of cruelty. But it really also helps to identify for facilities that, and Temple also referred to building a culture of animal wellness that gives an operation needs to have ownership of the ability to implement things that make sense. And it gives them an opportunity also to explore and realize that they have a way to problem solve and generate ideas for solutions that would very, very specific to their operation, but also is aligned with their ability to meet their own animal welfare objectives or their customers, if that applies. It also helps if they can take a complex subject and then be able to implement practical and simple approaches. If you haven't had the opportunity, NSF had published the Watt publication on global animal wellness, and we had an article that was provided by Temple Grandin on building a culture of animal wellness. So if you haven't had a chance to read that, reach out to us. We can send you the link and the contact, the information, so you can access that publication and read that. So the next step is identifying and looking at the preventive and control measures. This is where, for all of those identified hazards and using your risk approach to it, what are the preventive and control measures you currently got in place at the operation that are effectively eliminating or minimizing those hazards to an acceptable level? This is also a point where you would determine, do I need a critical control point or even a point of particular attention, or is everything being covered really well by my prerequisite program? So this is now just really getting a look into some of those prerequisite programs. That's usually the first level of control that you might have in place. So if you've identified a hazard of poor feed quality, you may want to have in place there your prerequisite programs of having an approved supplier program or a pasture improvement plan if you're providing pasture to your animals. Say the hazard was animal loss due to predation. Your prerequisite program could include fencing design and maintenance of your fences. So there's just a couple of examples there. So if you had the last one, a hazard was a sensible animal on the bleed rail at a slaughter operation. Your prerequisite programs would obviously include training programs and slaughter protocols, and maybe even specific protocols on how to handle a sensible animal on the bleed rail. The next step is taking a look at identifying your critical control points and points of particular attention. So just reviewing what's the definition of a CCP, this is a point in the process where failure to control the known hazard can lead to serious harm to people, animals, or equipment. And they really should meet those 5 criteria. They are really associated with that hazard of concern. They're measurable and or observable. There are strict standards with critical limits, and there's corrective measures in case of deviation, and that once it's corrected, it will reestablish full control of the process. A point of particular attention is a condition that could be threatening to animal health, welfare, public health, or on-farm management, but where there are no strict standards or thresholds that they have not or cannot be defined. And these are generally going to be influenced by many factors, including, and they can include, biological variation among live animals, interactions between management practices, because you will have operations that are utilizing some management practices, not in others, and that those impact the way a system is going to operate. And I'll get into a few examples of a point of particular attention as well as a CCP. Okay, so on the left-hand side, here are some examples of CCPs. Then these are generally something you expect to see, or they're in industry standards, industry accepted standards, or they're in certification standards, or they're in something else that is a well-known internationally accepted thing that's going to say, yeah, this is something you need to identify as a CCP. Body condition right up there for production. In transport, fitness for transport. If you've got a critical limit for the number of animals that are allowed to be transported that are not, or just having a zero tolerance for fitness or for the transport of an unfit animal. Those are things that you can put in as a CCP. Length of journey is also another one because it could be a regulatory requirement for length of journey. Stunning efficacy and bleed rail insensibility are another examples of good, clear points in the process where a CCP has and does fit well. Some examples here on the right are of production points of particular attention. For example, the age of breeding for a first pregnancy female. And depending on the species, there may or may not be some good science around best practices for it. But in terms of industry standards, there really aren't a lot of hard critical thresholds for these. There are some good best practices. So you may want, operations may want to choose to put in a point of particular attention defining that. For example, saying, I'm not going to breed my first pregnancy female until she reaches a certain age. Another production point of particular attention for broiler flocks could be uniform by bird size, and that may be set in terms of a percentage of the flock that's in uniform size. Another slaughter point of particular attention, it's measured, but in the North American Meat Institute's standard and guidelines, it's not something that's got a critical threshold, and that's the duration of holding animals in lairage. So again, it could be identified as a point of particular attention that's measured. Here are just another few examples of some CCPs and point of particular attention. At a farrowing unit, sow and gilt body condition could be considered a CCP. Pre-weaning mortality percentage could be considered either as a CCP, depending on if it's required at a specific threshold, for example, in a certification standard, or if not, it could be just a point of particular attention. And again, breeding weight of first parity gilts may be something that's identified as a point of particular attention. A lot of this really does depend on the operation as well. From a livestock loading process, these are just a few examples. CCPs, the number of falls on the loading or unloading ramp, fitness for transport. A point of particular attention could be ensuring that that interface between the truck and the loading ramp and maybe even the side panels on a loading ramp, they may be something that's a critical or a point of particular attention. Sometimes if it's defined in a particular requirement, for example, there are some transport requirements that define a threshold for the angle of a loading ramp for pigs. So if that's required, then that could also actually be utilized as a CCP. So once you have those control points, the CCPs and the point of particular attention defined, what you want to do is ensure that there's limits established for each of them. And these critical limits are, for a CCP, the criterion that separates acceptability from unacceptable. This is going to take into account whether or not there's any statutory or regulatory requirement, any accepted industry thresholds. For example, we talked about that in terms of stunning efficacy and bleed rail insensibility. Customer requirements may define those critical limits for you, or certification standards. They may also define those critical limits. There may be other relevant data that support selection of a critical limit. For the identified points of particular attention, these really do come down to the operations and procedures, because you're going to have unique objectives, management strategies, and approaches. And so it would be, it's really advisable to consider operation-specific targets for thresholds, or tolerance limits rather, for a point of particular attention. They can be aligned, and a lot of times this is what you expect to see, alignment with industry best practices, but that they're not really requirements within standards. So just to give a few examples of critical limits. So looking back at that production CCP of a body condition score, the critical limit could be set at a body condition score of 2. And that depends, that could definitely depend on your scale that you're utilizing for your body condition scoring, so you'd have to define that as well. Transport CCP that we identified fitness for transport, a critical limit that we see established in the North American Meat Institute guidelines is only 1% of compromised animals are allowed at arrival. A slaughter CCP of bleed rail insensibility, the critical limit there is 100% insensibility on the bleed rail. And examples of tolerances for points of particular attention, going back to the production point of particular attention for the age of breeding for a first calf heifer, the tolerance could be set at animals, females are not bred before they reach 24 months of age. Looking at that point of particular attention for the uniform bird size in a broiler flock, the tolerance could be set at 95% uniformity, or whatever the operation decides. Looking at that duration of holding, right now there's an industry recommendation for a tolerance of held for 1 hour per 4 hour of journey time. So this could be something that gets put into place. So once you've got all that set up, the next step is step 4, establishing your monitoring requirements. How are you going to measure and determine whether or not that CCP or point of particular attention are actually being met? So this is where you're going to be looking at what types of measures, and this is where you're looking for objective evidence. Once you also start gathering this information, when you have a point of particular attention set in there, the results of that monitoring may also guide you into determining whether or not you should actually consider a point of particular attention as a CCP. So something that maybe keep going out of tolerance, maybe something you want to focus a little bit more attention on from a CCP perspective. So some good examples, or first of all, indicators or measures can be divided into 3 types. So the animal-based criteria is the first one, and that's looking at performance or outcome criteria, output or outcome criteria. And it's really looking at directly assessing the state of the animals themselves. This can include their behavior, physiology or immune measures, the incidence of injury to an animal, health problems, or production levels. The design criteria look at resources, inputs, or engineering criteria, and they generally describe the environment of the animals or the way the animals are kept. This can include things such as specific housing design, space allowances, group size, for example. Operation criteria. This describes the actual manipulations of the animals and include aspects such as handling practices, stunning procedures, and so forth. So when you're deciding on your choice of indicator, it must use a scoring system that will be objective, consistent, and repeatable by and between assessors. So when you're looking at animal assessments, these are examples of industry accepted measures because they've been shown to be objective. They can be repeatable, and they're consistent. So body condition score, weight, vocalization, measures of lameness, and so forth. Some of those facility and equipment function assessments could include water test results, pasture quality testing and feed testing, ventilation rates, air quality such as ammonia levels, and lighting measures. So those are just some examples of some of the good industry-accepted indicators. Some of the operation assessments we're familiar with is the frequency of the use of animal handling aids, such as how many times an animal gets prodded with an electric prod, or holding times before unloading animals, and so forth. So the next step is step 5. Once you're getting all of your indicators and you collecting your measures, when a critical limit or a tolerance is exceeded, you need to establish the corrective measures that need to be taken. And so these are actions that will ensure that the cause is identified and the parameter gets controlled. The parameter that's controlled at that CCP is brought back under control and recurrence is prevented. And the planned actions really should consider any specific corrections or corrective measures to also address any animal impacted when that critical threshold is exceeded. A really good example of that is if there is a sensible animal identified on the bleed rail, that there is immediate action to euthanize that animal and address that, that they become then insensible. So things like that, but there are other examples where a specific procedure and related training might be required to be able to ensure that if there's something that happens, because we know the world is not perfect, some things could happen, your thresholds and your limits could be exceeded, but you want to take immediate action with the animals that were just impacted by that. On step 6 is establishing the procedures to verify the control measures. So these are the verification activities that are going to be used by usually supervisory or management, and maybe by your animal welfare lead or the team, and looking at those prerequisite programs, the control points, the monitoring and record keeping, and verifying it's all being done according to the written program. And at some point, too, there's going to be validation activities to make sure those control measures, especially when they're properly implemented, are effectively controlling the hazard. Have you chosen the right ones? And that's going to be useful for ongoing improvement of your program. And the final step is step 7, effective record-keeping procedures. They want to have those procedures that document how the program's being implemented, and it should be appropriate, obviously, to the nature and size of operation. And it also, I'm finding a lot of times, it's really taking advantage of existing documentation that's already being done, but just putting it into a little bit more systematic approach. So when we're looking back at what the requirements for the global animal wellness standards are looking at in terms of that management system, that documentation should include the hazard analysis, the CCP and point of particular attention determination, the critical limit determination, and then records should include those CCP monitoring activities, deviations and associated corrective actions, and any modifications to that system. Some of the tools and resources that we have created and are available to anybody are templates for recording your animal welfare lead and team, a facility description template, process flow template, an animal welfare hazard analysis template, and a control point template. We're also working on creating some generic HACCP models that can be used as starting points for facilities as they're working on setting up and creating their HACCP plans. And that's really the content of the webinar that I wanted to cover. So I've got 10 minutes left, so I'm going to go through the questions and just make sure that we've got those questions covered. So if you've got any questions, now's a good time to add them. I'm not seeing a lot so far. Most of them were all about hearing the presentation. So until I see some more questions here, what I just wanted to do, let you know is this will come out to you as a recording, so you'll be able to read back through this again. The other thing is, if there's any tools or resources that you think might be helpful and you want to know how to get access to them, you can just send an email to us, animalwellness at nsf.org is the address, and we can certainly help connect you up with some tools that would be very useful for creating your HACCP plan. We find developing this approach a lot of times is going to really structure organizations and operations, and they'll really actually see whether or not some of the things and the procedures they have in place right now are really designed to do what they were hoping they were going to do. So I am not seeing any questions coming in at this point. I hope you've enjoyed the webinar. We're going to be doing another quarterly webinar the next quarter. So if you have any thoughts or ideas on things you would like to have us dive a little deeper into, please don't hesitate to send us an email or a note just to indicate some areas that you might like to see a webinar presentation on, and we can create that and deliver that for you. I guess, can I repeat how to get access to the tools? I'm going to ask the chairperson. Chairperson, could you enter in the chat box the the email address? It's animalwellness at nsf.org. That's the email address. You can send there it is. So you can send your request to that address, and we will be able to send back to you the templates that we have. We also delivered some training internal to our NSF auditors on conducting this hazard analysis, and we did a little bit of exercises with those auditors that were being trained. And so what I did is I also created a few mock-ups. So that's another thing we can send. We can send you the template you can actually just use and put your stuff into, but you can also take a look at the mock-ups. The mock-ups are intended to get some critical thinking. So they're not perfect, and it's a way to take a look at just examples of it. There's a question also about how do we access the recording? Because you're registered for this webinar, when the recording is ready, you will get an automatic email coming to you that will give you the link to the recording. And that's going to come out in just a few days. So that usually is a pretty timely thing, but you'll be able to access that. And feel free to share the recording with anybody you think would be benefiting from it. And if there's other questions that you come up with, maybe after you've reviewed this or you think about it after a while, again, send us any additional questions that you have to that email address, animalwellness@nsf.org, and we will certainly get somebody on the case and get you an answer as soon as possible. Looks like I have another question. Let me take a look at it. Nope, we took care of that one. Okay, so I'm thinking that's it. We got 6 minutes to spare, so if there are no other questions, I'm going to give you 6 minutes to back in your day. And I want to say very, very, very much how appreciative I am, and NSF is as well, of your participation in the webinar. And I'm hoping that it was useful and provided you with some information that's going to help you along the journey of improvement, continual improvement in the area of animal welfare and wellness at your operation or with any clients that you might be working with. So on that note, I'm going to say thank you very much, and we'll end the webinar. And have a great day. Thank you.